Today, we uncover the shocking truth about UK ketchup, because for years, most of us have been treating ketchup like it's just a harmless little squirt of tomato sauce on the side of a plate. Chips, burgers, bacon sandwiches, sausage rolls, summer barbecues, kids' dinners, and the classic British fry-up. It's always there, it's familiar, it's comforting. It's one of those products people barely even question because it's been in the fridge for as long as they can remember. But when you actually turn the bottle around and read what's inside some of these famous brands, the whole thing starts to look very different. Some of these sauces are sitting at more than 20 grams of sugar per 100 grams. That means what's being sold to you as a savory tomato condiment is in some cases drifting closer to a red dessert syrup. And the worst part is, the serving sizes on the label are tiny. Nobody at a barbecue is carefully measuring out a perfect little teaspoon. People are squeezing it over chips, burgers, sandwiches, and full plates of food. Then there's the texture trick. Real tomato sauce gets its thickness from properly cooked tomatoes, but many modern bottles rely on starches, thickeners, concentrated paste vinegar, salt, and sweeteners to recreate the feeling of something richer than it really is. That's why some bottles split on the plate, leaving that watery red ring around your food. That isn't normal old-fashioned sauce, that's the sign of a formula designed by food engineers. And this is where it gets even more interesting. A recent blind taste test reported by Which showed that one expensive high street favourite came last, while a cheaper supermarket bottle matched one of the most famous ketchup brands in Britain. So the question is simple. Are people really paying for better ketchup, or are they paying for the memory of better ketchup? So we've gone through the major ketchup brands currently sold in UK supermarkets and will expose the 7 ketchup products you need to avoid. Then I'll tell you the handful, the ones that are actually still worth buying. But before we get into the list, please hit like and click the hype button. Because when you hype this video, you're not just helping a channel, you're helping push this information out to more ordinary shoppers before they waste more money on products that keep getting cheaper in quality while the price keeps climbing. The more people see what's really on these labels, the harder it becomes for big food companies to quietly lower standards and hope nobody notices. So click the hype button, like the video, subscribe if you want more investigations like this, and let's get into it. Number 7. Daddy's Tomato Ketchup. Daddy's is one of those brands that instantly feels old-fashioned, British, and safe. The name alone sounds like something that's been sitting on family tables for generations. It gives off that retro cafe feeling, like fry-ups, chip shops, and proper old-school cupboard staples. But that's exactly why this one matters. Because nostalgia can be one of the most powerful ingredients in the whole bottle. Daddy's is now part of the same wider Kraft Heinz world as Heinz itself. So although the branding feels like a separate old British classic, the reality is that it sits inside the same modern corporate food system that has swallowed up so many household names. And when old brands get absorbed into massive food empires, the public often keeps trusting the label long after the actual food behind it has changed. The biggest concern with Daddy's is the sugar. It has been reported at around 22 grams of sugar per 100 grams, with some discussions putting it even higher depending on the version being checked. Either way, that's a huge amount for something people think of as a savory sauce. You're not just adding a bit of tang to your chips, you're adding a sweet, processed red coating that has been balanced to hit the tongue hard. And that's the clever bit. When the tomato quality isn't strong enough to carry the flavor naturally, manufacturers can lean on sugar, salt, vinegar, and thickening agents to create the impression of depth. It tastes bold, but not necessarily because the tomatoes are better. It tastes bold because the formula has been pushed into the sweet, salty, acidic zone that keeps people going back for another squeeze. That's why Daddy's is such a strong place to start. It's the heritage illusion. The bottle says Old British Comfort. The label feels familiar. The name feels harmless, but when you look properly, it's a modern processed sauce riding on an old emotional memory. And for older shoppers especially, that memory is powerful. It reminds people of when food felt more straightforward, more local, and less messed about with. But that's the problem. The memory might be traditional. The formula is modern. Number 6. Heinz Original Tomato Ketchup. This is the big one. The sacred bottle. The one so many people defend without even thinking. Heinz isn't just ketchup to a lot of British families, it's the ketchup. People grow up with it, trust it, and often assume every other brand is just trying to copy it. Heinz has been around since the 1870s, and that long history gives it a huge advantage. It doesn't have to prove itself every time you walk into a supermarket. The red bottle, the white label, the shape, the name, all of it has already done the work before you even read the ingredients. But here's the part people need to hear. Heinz Original is not some innocent little tomato sauce. It contains a heavy sugar load, reported at around 22 to 24 grams per 100, depending on the market and bottle being checked. That means nearly a quarter of the sauce can be sugar by weight. And when people use a generous amount, especially on chips or burgers, they can easily be adding several grams of sugar without even thinking about it. Then there's the famous tomato claim. Brands love saying things like 148 grams of tomatoes went into 100 grams of ketchup. It sounds amazing at first. It makes people imagine fresh, juicy tomatoes being cooked down slowly in a kitchen, but in modern mass production, this usually means concentrated tomato paste, often heavily processed, reduced, transported, and reworked into a final sauce. That doesn't automatically make it awful, but it does mean the marketing image and the factory reality aren't the same thing. The public sees fields of fresh tomatoes. The food industry sees commodity paste, vinegar, sugar, salt, and a formula that has to taste exactly the same every time. And that brings us to one of the most important points in the whole video. In blind taste testing reported by Which, Heinz scored very well, but it didn't stand alone. It was matched by a much cheaper supermarket bottle. That means the great British ketchup king might not be unbeatable after all. It might just be the brand people were trained to reach for. And once you understand that, the magic starts to fade, because if another bottle can match Heinz in a blind test, then what are people paying extra for? Better tomatoes or better branding? That's the uncomfortable question. Heinz might still taste good to millions of people, but tasting familiar isn't the same as being the best quality. Sometimes it just means the formula has been burned into the nation's memory. Number 5. Heinz No Added Sugar and Salt. Now this one might be the most frustrating bottle on the shelf because it's aimed directly at people who are trying to do the right thing. Parents see it and think, brilliant, less sugar for the children. Older shoppers see it and think, better for blood pressure, better for the waistline, more sensible. It looks like the responsible choice, and that's exactly why it deserves scrutiny. Because when companies remove sugar from a product that was built around sweetness, they still need to replace the taste. Somehow, the sweetness doesn't just disappear. In the Heinz reduced or no added sugar style products, the sweetness is often replaced with artificial sweeteners such as sucralose. Now, people can make their own decision on sweeteners, but the issue is the marketing. The front of the bottle makes it look like a cleaner product, but the back of the bottle tells you it's more of a swap. You're not necessarily going from processed to natural, you're going from sugar sweetness to artificial sweetness. And that matters because ketchup isn't supposed to taste like a dessert. If the food industry keeps training people, especially children, to expect extreme sweetness in savory food, then normal food starts tasting boring. Real tomatoes taste less exciting, vegetables taste dull, then the supermarket formula becomes the standard your tongue expects. That's how health washing works. It doesn't have to lie outright. It just has to show you one positive thing on the front while quietly changing the formula in ways that most people don't have time to think about. There's also the texture issue. When sugar and salt are reduced, the sauce often needs help to feel satisfying. That's where thickeners and modified starches can come in. The product still needs body. It still needs that glossy squeeze. It still needs to sit on the plate like normal ketchup. But if the natural structure isn't there, the formula has to build the texture another way. So, with Heinz No Added Sugar and Salt, the warning isn't just sugar bad, it's more subtle than that. The warning is that healthier supermarket products can sometimes be ultra-processed in a different direction. They remove the thing people are scared of, then replace it with something that sounds scientific enough for most shoppers to ignore. That's why you can't just trust the front label. No added sugar doesn't automatically mean clean. Less salt doesn't automatically mean better. You still have to turn the bottle around. Number 4. Tesco Tomato Ketchup. Tesco is the everyday option. It's the normal family shop, the big trolley, the weekly basics. So when people pick up Tesco ketchup, they probably aren't expecting anything fancy. They just want a cheaper version of the big brand that does the job. And to be fair, that's exactly how supermarket own-brand products are usually designed. They look at the market leader, copy the general flavor direction, undercut the price, and try to make the difference small enough that most families don't care. But with ketchup, that approach creates a specific problem. If you're trying to copy a famous sweet, sharp, glossy ketchup as cheaply as possible, you're not necessarily building a better sauce. You're building an imitation of an already processed formula. Tesco ketchup has been criticized in taste reviews for being thin, watery, sharp, and not especially satisfying. And that watery quality is important, because texture tells you a lot. Good ketchup should have body from tomato solids. It shouldn't feel like red vinegar water pretending to be sauce. This is where modified starches often come into the conversation. When a sauce doesn't have enough natural tomato structure, the manufacturer can use starch to thicken it. That doesn't mean every starch is automatically terrible, but it does tell you something about the product. The thickness isn't coming purely from slow-cooked tomatoes, it's being engineered back in, and then you have the sweetness. Some Tesco ketchup versions have been discussed as sitting around the high teens to low 20s for sugar per 100 grams, depending on the exact label and current formulation. That's why we have to be careful with exact numbers, because supermarket recipes can change, but the broader point remains the same. This is still a sweetened, acidic, processed sauce that many people use far more generously than the tiny serving size suggests. The interesting thing about Tesco isn't that it's the most shocking bottle, it's that it represents the standard own-brand shortcut. It's the quiet middle of the shelf, not famous enough to be defended like Heinz, not premium enough to be questioned like M&S. It just sits there, looking ordinary, and that's exactly why people should check it, because ordinary is where a lot of these food downgrades hide. Not in the weird products, in the normal ones. Number 3. Morrison's tomato ketchup. Morrison's has a different image from Tesco. It leans more into fresh food, butchers, fish counters, market-style shopping, and a more traditional supermarket feel. So when people see Morrison's ketchup, they might assume it's a bit more honest, a bit more homely, and a bit less industrial. But again, the label matters more than the feeling. The issue with Morrison's isn't just sugar. It's the overall impression of a sauce that has to be built up to taste fuller than it really is. Some versions and reviews have described own-brand ketchups like this as thick, gloopy, sharp, or lacking depth. And that word depth is important. Real tomato flavor has layers, sweetness, acidity, savoriness, and a natural fruitiness. Industrial ketchup often has a front-loaded hit. Sweet first, vinegar second, salt underneath, and then very little real tomato finish. That's why vague wording on ingredients can be a red flag. When a label says natural flavorings, it doesn't necessarily mean someone lovingly added herbs and spices in a kitchen. It can simply mean a flavoring preparation that meets legal definitions but tells you very little as a shopper. You don't know exactly what flavor notes are being added. You don't know whether it's there to enhance good tomatoes or to cover weak ones, and this is what annoys people. Shoppers are expected to trust these labels, but the labels often don't speak in plain English. They tell you enough to be legal, but not always enough to feel fully informed. For older British viewers, this hits a nerve because they remember when sauces tasted simpler. Not necessarily perfect, but simpler. A bottle of sauce was supposed to taste like what it said on the front. Tomato ketchup should taste like tomatoes, vinegar, sugar, salt, and real seasoning. Not like a food technology project trying to recreate a memory. Morrison's is also a good example of why price and quality don't always line up neatly. It isn't necessarily the cheapest of the cheap, but it can still fall into the same supermarket formula trap. A little tomato base, sweetness, acid, salt, thickeners, and vague flavoring language. So the warning here is simple. Don't let the supermarket's overall image make the decision for you. Morrison's might feel more traditional, but the ketchup still has to pass the label test. Number 2. Aldi Bramwell's tomato ketchup. Now this one is interesting because Aldi has built its whole reputation around making shoppers feel like they've outsmarted the big brands. You pick up Bramwell's ketchup and the message is clear. Why pay more for Heinz when you can get something that looks similar, tastes familiar, and costs less. But this is where you have to be careful, because cheaper doesn't always mean better. According to the research we looked at, Aldi Bramwell's was flagged in taste testing for being too sweet and unbalanced. And that tells you a lot about the formula. When a ketchup doesn't have that deep, rounded tomato flavor, sugar can be used to do a lot of heavy lifting. It gives you that instant hit on the tongue. It makes the sauce feel more satisfying for the first second or two. But then the real flavor doesn't follow through properly. You get sweetness, sharpness, and vinegar, but not that rich tomato depth people actually think they're buying. And this is the budget ketchup trap. The bottle makes you feel like you're beating the system, but sometimes you're just buying a cheaper version of the same industrial idea. Water it down, sweeten it up, sharpen it with vinegar, thicken it enough so it still squeezes like ketchup, and hope the customer doesn't ask too many questions. Now, I'm not saying Aldi is the worst bottle in Britain. It isn't. But that's exactly why it belongs on the watch list, because it looks like the sensible choice. It feels like the clever money-saving option. And for some families, it might still be the only realistic option in the trolley. But if your ketchup has to lean heavily on sweetness to taste good, then you have to ask yourself one simple question. Are you buying proper tomato sauce or just a sweet red shortcut in a cheaper bottle? Number 1. Marks & Spencer Tomato Ketchup. Now this is the one that will annoy people, because M&S has spent decades building a reputation for quality. When shoppers go to Marks & Spencer, they expect better. They expect richer ingredients, better recipes, and a more premium version of ordinary supermarket food. So when M&S ketchup performs badly, it's not just disappointing, it breaks the spell. According to reports around The Witch blind taste test, M&S tomato ketchup came last with a score of 61%. That's the kind of result that should make shoppers stop and think. Because this wasn't a bargain basement bottle being judged harshly because it was cheap, this was the posh supermarket option being tasted blind, without the packaging doing the talking. And that's the key. Blind taste tests remove the theatre. No green food hall lighting, no premium label, no M&S reputation. Just the sauce. And when the brand disappears, the product has to stand on its own. The criticism around M&S ketchup included things like being too dark, too thick, and cloying. That word cloying matters because it suggests a sauce that sits heavily on the palate, not bright, balanced, and tomato-rich, but heavy, sweet, and a bit overdone. This is why M&S is number 1. It proves one of the most important lessons in British supermarket shopping. Premium branding doesn't always mean premium food. Sometimes you're paying for the store's reputation, the packaging, and the feeling that you've chosen something better. But if a cheaper bottle can beat or match the famous brands, and a premium bottle can come last, then the whole ketchup aisle starts looking like a psychological test. How much of what we buy is based on taste and ingredients, and how much is based on memory, class, branding, and habit? That's what makes the M&S result so powerful. It exposes the posh illusion. It shows that even the expensive-looking bottle can still be a disappointment once the label is hidden. And honestly, that might be the most important point in this whole video. The front of the bottle is marketing. The back of the bottle is where the truth usually lives. So how do you find the better stuff? The first rule is the 20-gram rule. Turn the bottle around and look at the sugar per 100 grams. If it's over 20 grams, you're not really looking at a savory sauce anymore. You're looking at something much closer to a sweet red syrup. The second rule is the texture test. Look for modified maize starch, modified cornstarch, or heavy thickening language. A little traditional thickening isn't always the end of the world, but when the whole sauce depends on starch to feel rich, you should ask why the tomatoes couldn't do that job themselves. The third rule is the splitting sign. If you squeeze the bottle and watery liquid runs out before the actual sauce, that's a clue. It usually means the formula doesn't have the natural structure you'd expect from a properly balanced tomato sauce. And the fourth rule is simple. Don't be fooled by the front label. Original, real, classic, no added sugar, premium, and heritage are all marketing words. Useful sometimes, but not proof. The ingredients and nutrition panel matter more. Now let's talk about the bottles that are actually worth considering. First, Asda Classic Tomato Ketchup. This is the budget plot twist. In The Witch blind taste test, Asda Classic reportedly tied Heinz with a score of 77%. That's a big deal, because it means the famous brand wasn't standing alone at the top. A supermarket own brand bottle managed to go toe-to-toe with it, while costing much less. Now, this doesn't mean Asda is suddenly some perfect artisan product. You still need to check the label, because supermarket ketchup is still supermarket ketchup. But for normal families dealing with food prices, this is important. Not everyone can spend several pounds on a premium bottle of sauce. People need realistic options, not just fancy recommendations that sound good but don't fit the weekly shop. That's why Asda Classic deserves a place on the worth it list. It challenges the big brand price trap. It shows that shoppers don't always need to pay more just because a brand has been around longer. Second, Little Bat's tomato ketchup. This one came up strongly in viewer discussions, and it makes sense. Little Bat's has been praised as a practical budget option, with reported tomato puree content around 77% and sugar around 19.3 grams per 100 grams in one viewer breakdown. Again, labels can change, so always check the bottle in your own shop, but that puts it in a far more sensible place than many of the sweeter mainstream options. And this is exactly what people need during the cost of living crisis, not a lecture telling them to spend £5 or £6 on a fancy sauce every week. A realistic supermarket option that's better balanced, affordable, and easy to find. If you're feeding a family, Little Bat's is the sort of product that makes sense to check first. It may not be the most luxurious ketchup in Britain, but it's a strong everyday alternative for people who want to move away from the most expensive big brand bottles without feeling punished for having a budget. Third, Stokes Real Tomato Ketchup. Stokes is where you go when you want ketchup to taste more like a proper condiment again. It's richer, thicker, and more grown-up than the usual red squeeze bottle. Instead of tasting like sharp sugar water, it has more of that cooked tomato depth people expect when they imagine old-fashioned sauce. It's more expensive, so I'm not going to pretend it's the answer for every household. But as a quality benchmark, Stokes is important. It shows what ketchup can be when the brand isn't just chasing the cheapest possible mass-market formula. And this is useful even if you don't buy it every week. Taste something like Stokes once, and it becomes much easier to spot how hollow some mainstream ketchups are. You start noticing the watery separation. You start noticing when the sweetness arrives before the tomato. You start noticing that some sauces don't really have a finish. They just hit you with sugar, vinegar, and salt, then disappear. Fourth, Rubies in the Rubble. Rubies in the Rubble has one of the best stories in the ketchup aisle because it focuses on using surplus fruit and vegetables that might otherwise be wasted. That gives it a completely different feel from the big corporate bottles. Instead of taking a historic brand and squeezing the formula harder for profit, this brand starts with the idea of rescuing real produce. It's also often praised for having a cleaner, shorter ingredient approach and lower sugar than many mainstream competitors, with some discussions putting it around 16 grams per 100 grams. That's still sugar because ketchup is always going to have sweetness, but it's a much more sensible place to be than the bottles pushing above 20 grams. This is the kind of brand that feels more aligned with where food should be going. Less waste, better ingredients, clearer purpose, and less of that industrial red syrup feeling. Again, it won't be the cheapest option, but if you want a cleaner ketchup and you're willing to pay more for it, Rubies in the Rubble is one of the most interesting choices on the shelf. Fifth, Bella Zoo Tomato Ketchup. Bella Zoo is the premium food lover's option. This is the one for people who want ketchup that tastes less like a children's squeeze bottle and more like a proper sauce made for actual food. The standout angle is the use of high-quality Italian tomatoes, including San Marzano-style positioning in some discussions, and a more complex vinegar and seasoning profile. It's the sort of ketchup that works because it isn't trying to simply copy Heinz. It's aiming for a richer, more adult flavor. Now, it's definitely not the budget choice. This is more of a special bottle than an everyday family basic, but it earns a place because it shows the other end of the aisle. If Asda and Lidl show you that budget shoppers still have options, Bella Zoo shows you what happens when ketchup is treated like a real food product rather than just a cheap red topping. And that's the real point of this video. We're not saying everyone has to buy the most expensive bottle. We're saying stop buying blindly. Stop letting heritage labels, posh packaging, and health-washed slogans make the decision for you, because the ketchup aisle tells a bigger story about British food. Famous brands leaning on memory. Supermarkets copying formulas, premium shops sometimes under-delivering, budget bottles occasionally beating the giants, and shoppers being left to figure it out themselves with tiny labels and clever marketing. So next time you pick up a bottle, don't just look at the front, turn it around. Check the sugar, check the thickeners, check whether the brand is selling you real tomato flavor or just a sweet red habit in a plastic bottle. And if this video helped you, hit like, click the hype button, and help push this information to more people before the next weekly shop. Comment below and tell me which ketchup you've been using and which food we should cover next, because I'm going to keep doing more videos like this.